My name is Hannah Collins. I'm 28 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. And for most of my life, I believed that if I just worked harder, stayed quieter, and loved my family enough, eventually they would love me back the same way they loved my younger brother. I know how pathetic that sounds now, but when you grow up in a house where affection feels like something you have to earn, you become addicted to trying. My brother Ethan was 2 years younger than me, but in my parents' eyes, he was everything. The smart one, the funny one, the one with potential. And me? I was the responsible one, the child they depended on, the child they forgot. I didn't understand it when I was little. Back then, I thought maybe all families worked that way. Maybe every older daughter cooked dinner while her younger brother played video games upstairs. Maybe every teenage girl worked 2 part-time jobs while her parents emptied their savings account for their sons' baseball camps and private tutors. But deep down, I always knew something was wrong. I remember one Christmas when I was 13. My mother handed Ethan the newest gaming console on the market. He screamed so loud the neighbors probably heard him. Then she turned to me and smiled proudly as she handed me a pair of winter socks. Socks. And the worst part? I thanked her. Because that's what I did back then. I swallowed disappointment like medicine. "Your brother just has bigger dreams," my father used to say whenever I complained. Bigger dreams. Meanwhile, I was the one getting straight A's. I was the one cleaning the house. I was the one helping Mom pay bills after school when Dad's construction business slowed down. But none of it mattered. Ethan walked into a room and everyone lit up. I walked into a room and people asked me to help set the table. Still, I loved them. That's the embarrassing part. Even after years of feeling invisible, I still spent my entire 20s trying to become good enough for people who had already decided I never would be. And the night everything finally broke started with a phone call. A simple phone call that changed my entire life. I was sitting in my apartment after a 14-hour shift at the hospital. I worked as a registered nurse in the emergency department, and that week had been brutal. 2 overnight shifts, constant trauma cases, barely any sleep. I remember kicking off my shoes and collapsing onto the couch when my phone rang. Mom. I almost ignored it. Almost. But guilt is a powerful thing. So I answered, and immediately heard crying. "Hannah," she whispered. "Sweetheart, we need help." My stomach dropped. What happened? It's Ethan. Of course it was Ethan. Something always happened to Ethan. A car accident, a failed business idea, a girlfriend who used him, a gambling problem that mysteriously wasn't gambling because he had a system. Every family crisis somehow traced back to my brother. Still, I asked, "Is he okay?" "He's fine physically," Dad interrupted, grabbing the phone. His voice sounded tense. "But he's in serious financial trouble." I closed my eyes. There it was. Money. Again. "How bad?" Silence. Then Dad finally said, 70,000. I nearly laughed, not because it was funny, because my brain genuinely couldn't process the number. "What?" "He made some bad investments," Mom said quickly. "But he was trying to build a future." A future. That magical word they only used for Ethan. When I wanted to attend graduate school, they called it unnecessary debt. When Ethan lost $70,000 gambling on crypto and sports betting, he was building a future. I rubbed my forehead slowly. "And why are you calling me?" Another silence. Longer this time. Then Mom finally whispered the sentence that changed everything. "We need you to help him." I stared at the wall. Outside my apartment window, rain hit the glass in soft little taps. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. What exactly does help mean? Dad cleared his throat. "You have savings." I actually laughed this time, a short, broken laugh. "You mean the savings I spent 10 years building by working double shifts?" "Hannah." "No," I snapped. "No, I want to hear this clearly. You want me to give Ethan $70,000? It wouldn't be giving. Mom said quickly. It's helping family. Helping family. Funny how family only seemed to matter when they needed something from me. I stood up and started pacing. You didn't help me when I was drowning in student loans. That's different. How? You're stronger than Ethan. That sentence haunted me for months afterward. You're stronger than Ethan. As if my suffering somehow mattered less because I handled it quietly. I felt something shift inside me then, something old and exhausted. But before I could answer, Dad said something worse. If you don't help him, he could lose everything. And without even thinking, I whispered, What about me? Silence. Cold silence. Because for the first time in my life, I realized nobody in that house had ever asked that question before. 2. The golden sun. Growing up with Ethan was like living beside a small fire everyone was terrified would go out. My parents fed him attention constantly. Praise, excuses, money, protection. And every time he failed, they somehow blamed the world instead of him. When Ethan failed math in high school, the teacher was too harsh. When he crashed Dad's truck at 17, the road was dangerous. When he got arrested in college for drunk behavior outside a bar, my mother cried about how stress was affecting him. Stress. Meanwhile, I was working night shifts at a grocery store while attending nursing school full-time, surviving on instant noodles and caffeine. Nobody called me stressed. Nobody called me brave either. They just expected me to survive. That's the role they gave me early. Hannah survives. Ethan shines. And the messed up part? Ethan believed it too. He wasn't evil. Not at first. Just entitled. He grew up watching our parents rescue him from every consequence imaginable. So eventually, he stopped believing consequences even applied to him. By 26, Ethan had already dropped out of 2 colleges, started 3 failed businesses, burned through multiple loans, borrowed money from almost every relative we had. But somehow, he still walked into family dinners acting like a future millionaire. I remember Thanksgiving 2 years before everything collapsed. Everyone sat around the table while Ethan bragged about some new investment opportunity involving luxury rental properties. Dad looked at him like he was listening to a genius entrepreneur. Then Dad turned to me. Hannah, can you refill the drinks? That was my role in the family. Not daughter, not equal. Support staff. And I think part of me accepted it because I kept hoping one day they'd finally notice me. One day they'd say, We're proud of you too. But people rarely change when the system already benefits them. And my family's system was built around sacrificing me to protect Ethan. I just didn't realize how far they were willing to go. Not yet. Because 2 weeks after that phone call, they invited me to dinner. And that dinner became the beginning of the end. The dinner invitation came 3 days after the phone call. Mom texted me early Sunday morning. Please come tonight. We need to talk as a family. As a family. Those words used to mean warmth to me, safety, belonging. But by then, they mostly meant pressure. I almost said no. Honestly, I should have. But a small part of me still believed maybe this time would be different. Maybe they wanted to apologize. Maybe Ethan had finally admitted he messed up. Maybe my parents realized how unfair they were being. That hope followed me all the way to their house. It was raining again that evening. Oregon rain always felt personal somehow. Quiet. Heavy. Like the sky was carrying secrets. When I pulled into the driveway, Ethan's black SUV was already there. Of course it was. I sat in my car for almost a full minute staring at the house I grew up in. Same white siding. Same porch swing Dad built when I was 10. Same kitchen window where I used to stand washing dishes while Ethan played outside with friends. Some places trap memories inside their walls. This house was full of mine. The second I walked in, I smelled roast chicken and rosemary potatoes. Mom always cooked comfort food when she wanted something. Hannah! She called brightly from the kitchen, like nothing was wrong. You made it. I forced a smile. Dad sat at the dining table scrolling through his phone, while Ethan leaned back in his chair drinking beer like he didn't owe half the planet money. And somehow, he still looked confident. That irritated me immediately. "You look tired," Mom said as she hugged me. "I worked 12 hours. "You work too much," Ethan muttered. I stared at him. That was rich coming from someone who treated employment like a seasonal hobby. But I stayed quiet, because that's what I always did. Dinner started awkwardly. Small talk, weather, hospital stories, Dad complaining about gas prices. Nobody mentioned the $70,000. Not at first. And honestly, that made it worse, because I could feel the conversation sitting there at the table with us like a loaded weapon. Finally, halfway through dinner, Dad cleared his throat. "So." There it was. Mom immediately looked nervous. Ethan stared down at his plate dramatically, like he was the victim in all this. Dad folded his hands together. "We've been discussing options." Options. Interesting word choice considering nobody had asked what options I wanted. "And?" I said carefully. Dad sighed heavily like this conversation exhausted him already. "Your brother made mistakes." Mistakes. Not recklessness, not irresponsibility. Mistakes. "But he deserves a chance to recover." I put my fork down slowly. "And?" Mom jumped in quickly. "We know how hard you worked for your savings." "Then why are we talking about them?" Silence. Ethan finally spoke. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious." I looked at him carefully. "You already are asking." He leaned back defensively. "You have no idea what pressure I'm under." I almost laughed. "No, Ethan, I actually do. Because every time your life falls apart, somehow the pressure lands on me." His jaw tightened. Dad stepped in immediately. "Don't start attacking your brother." There it was again. The protection. Always the protection. I looked around the table and suddenly felt like I was 16 again, like nothing had changed. "I'm not attacking him," I said quietly. "I'm asking why I'm expected to fix problems I didn't create." Mom's eyes filled with tears instantly. And that's when I knew. They had already decided I was the villain, before I even answered. "Hannah," she whispered. "Families help each other." I felt anger rise into my throat. Really? Because I don't remember anyone helping me when I worked 2 jobs through nursing school. Dad frowned. "That was different." "How?" "You chose that path." I stared at him in disbelief. "I chose survival." Nobody answered. Outside, thunder rumbled softly in the distance. Ethan suddenly pushed his plate away. "You know what? Forget it," he muttered bitterly. "I knew she wouldn't help." That irritated me more than if he'd yelled, because he sounded disappointed in me, like I was failing him. I looked directly at him. "You lost $70,000. His expression hardened. "I was trying to build something." "With gambling apps and crypto schemes?" "It wasn't gambling." "Oh, really? Then why are debt collectors calling Mom?" The room froze. Mom looked horrified. Dad slammed his hand lightly against the table. "That's enough." "No," I snapped suddenly. "Actually, I'm tired of pretending this is normal." My voice shocked even me, because I almost never raised it. "I am tired of this family acting like Ethan's disasters are everyone else's responsibility." Ethan stood up immediately. "You think you're better than me because you're a nurse?" "No," I said coldly. "I think I'm exhausted because I've spent my whole life cleaning up after you." Mom started crying harder. Dad glared at me. "You're being cruel." Cruel. That word hit me hard. Not because it hurt, because it finally made something clear. In their eyes, protecting myself was cruelty. Sacrificing myself was love. And suddenly, I saw my entire childhood differently. Every ignored birthday, every canceled plan, every moment I stayed silent to keep peace, every time my needs became less important than Ethan's feelings. I stood up slowly. "I'm not giving him the money." Mom gasped softly. Ethan looked furious, but underneath the anger, I saw panic. Real panic. That's when I realized how bad things truly were. Dad's face turned cold in a way I'd never seen before. "If you walk away from family now," he said quietly, "don't expect family to be there later." A threat, not even subtle. I felt my chest tighten. For a second, a painful second, I almost gave in. Because that little girl inside me still wanted their approval, still wanted Dad to smile proudly at her, still wanted Mom to choose her first for once. But then something happened. Something small, and somehow worse than everything else. Mom reached across the table and grabbed Ethan's hand. Not mine, his, comforting him, protecting him, while I sat there shaking. And in that moment, I finally understood. They had already chosen, a long time ago. I was just the last person to accept it. So I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door. "Hannah, don't do this!" Mom cried behind me. I stopped for exactly 2 seconds. Not because I changed my mind, because part of me wanted them to stop me properly, to finally say, "We're sorry. You matter too. We were wrong." But instead, Dad said, "If your brother loses everything because of this, that's on you." I closed my eyes and quietly replied, "No, Dad." Then I opened the door. This was never my debt to carry. And I walked out into the rain. But I had no idea. The real betrayal hadn't even happened yet. Because 3 days later, I discovered what my parents were willing to steal from me to save their favorite child. 3 days after that dinner, I came home from another exhausting hospital shift and found 3 missed calls from my bank. At first, I thought it was fraud detection. Maybe someone had hacked my card. But the moment I called back and heard the nervous tone in the representative's voice, my stomach dropped. "Ms. Collins," she said carefully, "we noticed unusual withdrawal activity involving your savings account." I froze. What kind of activity? A pause. Then she listed the amount. $40,000. I actually stopped breathing for a second. "What?" My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "There was an authorized transfer request submitted yesterday morning." Authorized. "No," I whispered immediately. "No, I didn't authorize anything." The woman sounded uncomfortable now. "The paperwork included your signature." My blood turned cold. Because suddenly, I knew exactly who had done it. I drove to my parents' house so fast I barely remember the trip. Rain hammered the windshield the entire way, and my chest felt tight enough to crack. I kept praying there had to be some misunderstanding. There had to be. Because even after everything, some part of me still couldn't believe my own parents would steal from me. But the second I walked through that front door and saw Ethan sitting comfortably on the couch, I knew. Mom stood up immediately. "Hannah, did you take my money?" Silence. That terrifying kind of silence that answers everything before anyone speaks. Dad slowly walked into the living room. His expression wasn't guilty. It was defensive. And somehow, that hurt more. "We were going to tell you," he said. I stared at him in disbelief. "You forged my signature?" Mom burst into tears instantly. "We had no choice." No choice. Those words echoed in my head like a siren. "No choice?" I repeated slowly. "You stole $40,000 from your daughter." "It's temporary," Dad snapped. "Ethan needed help immediately." I looked at Ethan. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Coward. "You robbed me," I whispered. Mom grabbed my arm desperately. "Hannah, please understand." I yanked my arm away. "No, You understand. My voice cracked for the first time. That money was my future. 10 years. 10 years of overnight shifts, missed vacations, cheap apartments, secondhand furniture, exhaustion, loneliness. Every sacrifice I made sat in that account, and they handed it away like it belonged to Ethan all along. Dad's face hardened. You're acting selfish. Selfish. Even then, even after stealing from me. I laughed, and honestly, that laugh scared all of them, because it didn't sound hurt anymore. It sounded finished. You know what's funny? I said quietly. I spent my whole life believing if I loved this family enough, eventually you'd love me back. Mom sobbed harder, but I kept going. I thought maybe if I worked harder, gave more, stayed quieter, someday I'd matter as much as Ethan. Dad looked uncomfortable now. Good. But I finally understand something. I looked directly at him. You don't love me. You love what I survive. The room went completely silent. Even Ethan looked shaken. Because deep down, they all knew it was true. My parents didn't admire my strength. They depended on it. They built an entire family system around the assumption that Hannah would endure anything. And for years, I did. Until that moment. Dad finally lost patience. For God's sake, Hannah, it's family money. Family money. I nodded slowly. No, I whispered. It was mine. Then I pulled out my phone. Dad frowned. What are you doing? I looked him dead in the eyes. Calling the police. Mom gasped so loudly she nearly choked. Ethan stood up instantly. Hannah, don't be insane. Insane. Interesting choice of words from a man whose gambling addiction destroyed everyone around him. Dad's face turned red. You would report your own family? I stared at him for a long moment, then finally answered. You reported me emotionally every single day of my life. And I dialed. That's when panic finally hit them. Real panic. Mom started begging. Dad started yelling. Ethan started pacing. But for the first time in my life, I didn't fold. Because something inside me had finally broken free. And honestly, it felt incredible. The next few months were chaos. The police investigation moved faster than I expected because the forged documents were obvious. My father had copied old paperwork from previous family loan documents and tried to imitate my signature. Sloppy, desperate, illegal. And Ethan? The money was already gone. Almost all of it. Debt payments, bad investments, online betting accounts. $40,000 disappeared in less than 2 weeks. When detectives questioned him, he kept insisting he thought Mom and Dad had permission. Maybe part of him actually believed that. Because in our family, my boundaries had never mattered before. Why would they start now? But legal consequences don't care about family traditions. Dad was charged with fraud and financial forgery. I'll never forget the look on his face the day detectives escorted him from the house. Not anger, shock. Pure shock. Like he genuinely never believed consequences could touch him. Mom called me over 30 times that week. Sometimes crying, sometimes furious, sometimes begging. You're tearing this family apart! No. The truth was, the family had been broken for years. I had just stopped pretending otherwise. Relatives started choosing sides. Some called me heartless. Others quietly admitted they weren't surprised. And then something unexpected happened. My Aunt Valerie called me one night. Hannah, she said softly, I need to tell you something. I sat silently on my couch, listening. When you were little, she whispered, your grandmother used to worry about you. My throat tightened. What do you mean? She said your parents treated you differently. She noticed it for years. I closed my eyes. Part of me felt validated. Another part felt devastated. Because that meant it had been visible all along, even as a child. There's something else, Valerie continued carefully. Your grandmother left you something in her will. I frowned. What? A trust fund. I nearly laughed from disbelief. What are you talking about? She never trusted your parents with it, Valerie said. She worried they'd give everything to Ethan. I couldn't speak. Tears filled my eyes instantly. Not because of the money, because for the first time in my life, someone had seen me, really seen me. My grandmother passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness. At the time, my parents told me there was almost nothing left financially after medical bills. That was a lie, too. She had left me nearly $200,000 in a protected trust. Untouchable by my parents. Untouchable by Ethan. Protected specifically for me. I broke down crying harder than I had in years. Not because I suddenly became wealthy, but because my grandmother had done something nobody else in my family ever did. She protected me, even after she was gone. 6 months later, Ethan lost everything. The apartment, the SUV, the fake business image, everything. Debt collectors came after him aggressively once my parents could no longer shield him financially. And without Dad constantly rescuing him, reality finally caught up. One afternoon, he showed up outside my apartment unexpectedly. I almost didn't recognize him. He looked exhausted, older, smaller somehow. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, I never thought you'd actually do it. I crossed my arms. Do what? Choose yourself over us. Us. That word irritated me instantly, because us had always meant Ethan, not me. He rubbed his face tiredly. You know Mom barely leaves the house now. I stayed silent. Dad blames himself. That almost made me laugh. Almost. Ethan looked at me carefully. You really hate us now? And honestly, that question changed everything, because I realized something important in that moment. I didn't hate them. Not anymore. Hate requires emotional attachment. What I felt now was grief. Grief for the family I kept begging them to become. I don't hate you, I said quietly. Then why does this feel like punishment? I stared at him for a long moment, then finally answered. Because for the first time in your life, nobody's protecting you from consequences. He looked away immediately. And that silence told me I was right. For years, Ethan believed he was special. But he wasn't special. He was sheltered. There's a difference. Before leaving, he hesitated near my door, then quietly asked, Did they really love me more? That question hit harder than I expected, because despite everything, part of Ethan had suffered too. Being the favorite child sounds wonderful from the outside, but sometimes it creates adults who never learn accountability, stability, or emotional maturity. My parents hadn't really loved either of us properly. They just damaged us differently. I sighed softly. They loved protecting you more. He nodded slowly like that answer hurt. Then he left. And strangely, that was the last time I ever saw him. A year later, my life looked completely different. I left the hospital and completed my graduate program. I bought a small townhouse with part of my grandmother's trust. Nothing extravagant. But it was mine. Mine. That word still felt emotional sometimes. For the first few months living there, I kept waiting for guilt to arrive. Waiting for regret. Instead, I felt peace. Real peace. The kind that comes when you stop sacrificing yourself for people determined to misunderstand you anyway. Therapy helped too. A lot. Because healing from family betrayal is strange. You grieve people who are still alive. You mourn childhoods you never had. You slowly realize love should not require suffering to prove itself. And the hardest lesson? Understanding that being needed is not the same as being valued. For most of my life, my family needed me, but they never truly valued me. Once I understood that, everything changed. Sometimes people ask if I regret calling the police. The answer is no. Not because I wanted revenge, but because accountability was the only thing that finally stopped the cycle. And maybe that sounds cold. But enabling someone until they destroy themselves isn't love either. The truth is, families can break you in ways strangers never could. Because when strangers hurt you, it's painful. But when family hurts you, part of you wonders whether you deserved it. That's the real damage. And if anyone listening to my story feels invisible inside their own family, I need you to hear this carefully. Love should not cost your dignity. Support should not require self-destruction. And being the strong one should not mean enduring endless pain silently. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop carrying people who would never carry you. My name is Hannah Collins, and the day my parents chose my brother over me was the day I finally chose myself.